Hi, this tutorial is brought to you by pm-prep35.com. We are an online PMP training website and we offer free mock exams and chapter tests. Do visit pm-prep35.com for all the free resources. In this session, I'm going to cover define scope process. This process is part of project scope management knowledge area, and it falls in the planning process group. Scope is one of the important areas in terms of project management. It is also one of the triple constraints you call in project management, and the triple constraints are scope, time and cost. So scope is one of the important processes that needs a lot of attention in project management. When you talk about scope, there are mainly two scope that you are really concerned about. One is the product scope, and then there is the project scope. The product scope, when you talk about product, the product is what the project is supposed to build. So if you see from that point of view, it is not only a product that a project can create, but also a service or a result. So when you say product scope, it can mean either of these. It can be a service scope or the scope of the result that you're going to create out of the project, but generically it is called as product scope. The product scope is the sum of all the functionalities, features, characteristics that the product should have. But the project scope covers more than that in terms of looking at what are the phase-wise deliverables and other things the project should cover, because a project has a life cycle, and that life cycle can span from analysis, design, then development, implementation, or then post support and things like that. So obviously when you look at from that point of view, the product life cycle starts from the idea, then that idea is studied, and then there is a decision to take it over as a project. The project can be in terms of specifying the requirements, designing, then you develop the product and the deliverables, then there is acceptance testing, and then implementation. Now each of these things can in turn be projects, but then the idea here is to specify or talk about the difference between product life cycle and project life cycle. A product life cycle is broader than a project life cycle. The product life cycle spans from the conceptualization, then feasibility studies, then building the product as such, and then post implementation there is an operational effort that goes in, and then during operation you might come up with some changes, and then those are documented, and again there's a project that gets involved. So anywhere in this whole scope of product there can be projects involved. Understand that the project is a temporary endeavor to create a unique product, service or result, and when you say temporary, it has a definite beginning and ending. But the product scope is a lot more bigger. It starts from the idea conceptualization, then it gets built, and in the process of building you might have different phases, then it becomes operational, and then obviously after it becomes operational there might be a new idea that comes in. So a product can be decommissioned or a new version of the product can be created. So that's where the product life cycle is different from the project life cycle. Now from there you come to the product scope, difference between product scope and project scope. The product scope is some of the features or the characteristics or the functionalities the product should have, but project scope is if you take up something, if I want to build a particular product, then the boundaries that are involved in it in terms of analysis of the requirements, designing it, then developing it, testing it, then making it ready to be operational. So this becomes the project boundary, but the product scope product scope is more related to what all functionalities the specific product should have. So that's the difference between product scope and the project scope. The term life cycle and scope have different meanings because they are applied to different contexts with reference to the product or the project that we are talking about. So with that in mind, so now when you look at the defined scope process as such, the defined scope process is related to defining the scope of the project. When you build a project, when you're involved with a project, you're obviously dealing with building a deliverable or an end product. So you have to define the scope of the product also. So the defined scope process defines the project scope, but in the process there will be a product scope also that should be taken care of. Now when you talk about project scope, there will be interim deliverables for each of the phases that you have decided to have in this particular project, and those also become part of your project scope statement. So defined scope process is more concerned about creating the project scope statement, which has all the details about what are the project boundaries, what will be covered within this project, what will be the deliverables. When you talk about deliverables, it will be both the interim deliverables and as well as the end product that the project will create. So it will talk about the boundaries and what will be the exclusions, what will not be part of this particular project. The scope will cover boundary apart from which nothing will be dealt as part of this particular project. So now obviously before the scope is decided, you will have to cover the requirement documentation. The requirement documentation might cover anything, obviously keeping this project objectives in the mind or the business objective in the mind. You'll prepare the requirement documentation. That's why you have project charter as an input there. But then once you create the requirement documentation, it doesn't mean that you will cover everything that's documented in the requirement documentation. You will weigh a lot of things, like in terms of what is the time that is available on hand, what is the cost that is available on hand. Based on that, you will cut down certain requirements, and that's what becomes your scope. So defining the scope is more of an iterational process, a lot more iterative in nature compared to when you are documenting the requirements. The requirements has everything. It just keeps in mind the project objectives or the business objectives, and it pulls as much from the stakeholders as much is possible. But then when you come to the defining of the scope, you weigh what is my time available, what is the cost that is available, what is that is really important at this moment, and then I will define my scope. So that's where the exclusions come into picture, and it's very vital. So now the acceptance criteria in this particular scope statement is lot more relevant and lot more important compared to what you have in your requirement documentation. So remember that when you define the scope, it's a lot more iterative in terms of understanding what is the context, what is the time available with me, what is the cost available with me, and then you trim your requirements to decide these are within scope, these are out of scope, and you deal with only things that are within scope. If you go out of the way to do something to the customer that is not specified in the scope statement, then it is not called customer satisfaction, it is called a scope creep. So that's where a proper understanding of scope is really important. So with that basis, let's quickly walk through some of the important points in defined scope process. The defined scope process deals with setting the project boundaries in terms of deciding the inclusions and exclusions among all the requirements collected. So you do a requirement gathering, then you have a requirement documentation, but you don't deal with all the requirements in the requirement documentation, because when you deal with the requirement, when you build the requirement documentation, you're not really concerned about the cost or the timelines. You just get everything from different stakeholders. Then you prioritize. After you prioritize, you look at what is available with you, or in other words, you come up with some sort of if you have to build so many requirements into so many of these all these requirements at this point of time, then it takes so much of time. So but you have a already available time and cost which is specified as part of the project charter. You take a look at that. then you weigh your requirements, then you say, no, if you build all these requirements, it will be so much cost and so much time, but you have only so much time and cost on hand. So then you trim down your requirements to come up with the scope statement. So that's where the requirement gathering process is a separate one compared to the define scope process, but definitely the requirement gathering process becomes a input for this particular define scope process. Define scope process decides the project and product scope. It not only deals with the project scope, it also deals with product scope. The product scope is more concerned about the end product of the project, but the project scope can have deliverables which more relates to the interim deliverable of each of the phases that you have decided to make part of this particular project life cycle. Define scope process is a highly iterative process because multiple factors are dependent on it, because scope of the project is based on triple constraints, and scope is one of the triple constraints. So that's where you need to keep in mind weighing in the time and cost on hand. So with that in mind, so let's quickly brainstorm what could be the inputs of this particular process, because when you look at PMBOK, the project management body of knowledge, you look at each of the process from the point of ITTOs, input, tools and techniques, and outputs. So with that in mind, let's look at what could be the inputs for this particular process. Okay, based on what we have discussed so far, one of the most important input is the requirement documentation, because it has all the requirements that we have collected as part of collect requirements process, but not all of those will be dealt. But then next comes the scope management plan. The scope management plan tells how to build the scope statement. What are the tools that we would use for building the scope statement? So those general details, the planning for the define scope process is all in the scope management plan. So that's one of the input for this particular process. The requirement documentation has all the scope that you would want to cover and probably decide what would be excluded, but then you have the scope management plan which tells how the define scope process will be done, what is the significance and all that. So now you have scope management plan, then you have requirement documentation. The next important input is the project charter, which again tells you what is the project objective. It's necessary to keep this in mind. Basically, you will be next coming up with the acceptance criteria in more detail, and you will fix that or you freeze that. So that's where it's necessary to keep the project charter in mind. Although project charter was an input for collect requirements process where the requirement documentation was created, it is more of a guiding force there in terms of telling it's good to collect these requirements, it's good to collect that requirement. But here the role of project charter is more in lines of looking at what is the time, high level time, what is the high level cost. So based on that you can trim down your requirements or you can define the scope better. That's where the project charter is a vital input here. So now apart from these, you obviously have the organizational process sets, because you might have some templates that are used effectively in previous projects. So that's where you use your organizational process assets, you refer and use some of the templates that have been used in previous projects successfully. So that's where organizational process assets is an important input. Understand that enterprise environmental factors are one such input, wherein they are mostly found in one of the first processes in initiating and planning process group. As you get into the depth, for example, if you look at the define scope process falls one or two levels down the planning process and scope. So that's where you don't find environmental factors as one of the inputs. So that's where organizational process is an input, but not environmental factors. But if needed, look at these inputs as something like what is most commonly used. So but if it is a necessity, you will have to look at environmental factors, or if there is a change in environmental factors, you need to consider that. So now with this, these are the inputs for this particular process. One of the the four inputs are scope management plan, then you have the project charter, then you have the requirement documentation, then you have the organizational process asset as the input for this process. Now, as part of this process, what you would do is product analysis. Product analysis is nothing but you will look at what will form my end product. Don't imagine an end product would be always a single product, but there might be multiple components that can be part of that particular end product. So that's where you will do product analysis, as well as you do some benchmarking and stuff like that. So you do product analysis to see what are the components or the subcomponents to create the end product. So that's where product analysis is really important. Then you have alternatives generation. Because you have time and cost involved, you might look at what are the different alternative ways of building this particular end product. So that's where alternative generation is important technique. Then you have expert judgment as ever, because this is one of the process wherein you need expert input in terms of deciding what effective alternatives would be better to use compared to, in terms of the situation on hand. So that's where alternatives identification is important technique. Then you have product analysis, wherein you see what are the components. I know what I need, but then I need to break that down. So that's where you have product analysis. So although obviously the breakdown that I'm talking about is more relevant to the breakdown in terms of PMBOK is more relevant to in terms of creating the WBS process, but what I am talking about is a preliminary understanding of what is required. So that's where product analysis or deciding what deliverables would be part of this particular scope statement is product analysis really an important technique used in this particular process. So these are the vital techniques. You have facilitated workshop as also one of the techniques, wherein if you have to weigh different requirements, you have to decide which should be part of this particular scope and which can be part of later iterations. You have to have facilitated workshops with different subject matter experts. So that's where facilitated workshop is one of the important techniques. So the techniques for this process are alternatives generations, then you have expert judgment, then you have product analysis, then you have facilitated workshop. So the output of this process is project scope statement. The project scope statement has the product description, constraints, assumptions, deliverables, exclusions, and acceptance criteria is very vital. So when you get your scope statement, you also make updates to other project documents. So that can be in terms of revisiting the requirement documentation. So that's where project document updates is one of the important outputs. Let's quickly walk through a sample scope statement template here. The scope statement has the business objectives, which is pulled from the project charter. Then you have the project description. So you also, apart from this, you look at what are the project boundaries, what will be included in this particular project, what will not be. So for each of the deliverable, when you define the scope, you say include, what's not included, completion criteria, risk assessment, constraints, dependency to other parts of the project, impacts, critical success factors, or some of the sections in this particular document. You also specify roles. These are based on your requirement, or you tailor your project scope statement, but then the main idea that you should have in mind is the project scope statement deals with specifying what would be the deliverables, what would be my boundaries, what would be the included, what is not included, which is very important in case of the scope statement. So you also talk about the product scope as well as the project scope. The product scope tells what are the characteristics, features, functionalities of the product. The project scope deals with telling what are the phases, what would be the deliverable for each phase, and things like that. So that's about the define scope process, which deals with the creation of your scope statement. Do visit pm-prep35.com for free mock exams and other chapter tests. Thank you.